Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, Episode 21. I am your host, Stephanie Corey, filling in for the late Richard Behrens, author of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. The Lizzie Borden Podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, and sometimes the history of her hometown, Fall River, Massachusetts. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens. Each episode explores some aspect of the mystery that is Lizzie Borden, from the origins of the doggerel, Lizzie Borden Took an Axe, to a primer on the case by noted authors and experts, including dramatic readings of Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective mystery series. Please subscribe to us on YouTube so we can meet the magic number they have set for us to be able to remove advertisements, which we see no revenue from. Please also consider supporting the Lizzie Borden Podcast on Patreon so we can continue to produce high-quality podcasts. In this episode, we interview Rory Raven, author of 3 books of nonfiction, The Door War, Burning the Gaspee, and my favorite, Wicked Conduct, about the Sarah Cornell murder in Fall River in 1832, as well as 3 works of fiction, Gallows Hill, Summerland, and most recently, Signor Lugosi and Other Stories. Rory is also a tour guide in Salem, giving talks on various historical topics, including the witch trials. Richard Behrens wrote about the Sarah Cornell case. His essay, The Reverend and the Mill Girl, An Unsolved Fall River Mystery, was originally published in 2008 in The Hatchet and now appears in Of Moons and Monoliths, published by Nine Muses Books. And now, the Lizzie Borden Podcast presents an interview with Rory Raven. Rory Raven is a performer, writer, and tour guide for his company Salem on Foot. He grew up surrounded by books, history, and the long shadows of Poe, Hawthorne, and Lovecraft. Originally from Providence, Rhode Island, he currently lives in Salem with his patient, long-suffering wife, their treeing walker coonhounds, and a pair of black cats. He left his heart in Rhode Island, where it is burned on a rock.
Burned on a rock.
Oh, so you burned your heart on a rock, like your love.
Mercy Brown joke.
Oh, I'm so slow. Okay.
Sometimes just tell them for yourself.
Welcome, Rory.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to the Lizzie Borden Podcast. Your book on Sarah Cornell, called Wicked Conduct, which is an outstanding title. Did you get to choose your title?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, it's an outstanding title. Of course, it comes from the documents of the period, which I really liked. The actual murder of Sarah Cornell occurred in a part of Fall River, Massachusetts, that was once Rhode Island in 1832.
Yep.
Actually, where probably Kennedy Park is today, the lower part of Kennedy Park.
By the swimming pools, from what I remember.
And the tennis courts, according to the picture in the book.
Tennis courts, all right.
It's a really great read, and it offers this really perfect condensed telling of the story and the crime and its aftermath. What inspired you to write a book about this subject? And do you think there's more to say?
There might be more to say at some point. What inspired me was I first came across the case probably in the very early 90s. There was academic press was reprinting Catherine Williams's Fall River, An Authentic Narrative. I had never heard this story before, but this book was being reprinted, and the Providence Journal ran a 3-page article on the case. And I read this and thought, wow, this sounds amazing. I clipped out that 3-page article. I still have it in the mess that I jokingly refer to as my files, and held on to it. And I'm not bitter, but I'll tell the story anyway. I was working at Brown Bookstore at the time, and I went to the buyer. I said, hey, I just read this big article in the journal that said there's this book being reprinted from this academic press, and it sounds like it's going to be kind of a big deal. Are we getting copies? And he said, yes, I've ordered 1 copy. And I said, well, hey, no, I don't want to tell you your job, but like this was a big article and this seems like a big deal. Do you think we need more than one copy? And he nodded and he smiled and he ordered a second copy and all but patted me on the head and sent me on my way. Those two copies came in, a few days later. They came and went the same day. They sold, the two copies sold that very day, and then he couldn't get any more copies because all the distributors were sold out because so many people wanted this book. I'm not bitter, but I'll just tell that story anyway.
That's a good story. That's a really good story.
So, I was aware of the case from that article and thought, well, this sounds interesting, and kind of had it in the back of my mind for a long time. And then the history press came to me and said, do you want to write a book based on your walking tour? I was doing the Providence Ghost Walk at the time, sort of a spooky history walking tour, Providence. And I had done that for a few years. They said, do you want to write a book about that? And I said, sure. So I wrote that book collecting ghost stories and legends and folklore about spooky stuff in Rhode Island. And that book went out, and a year later, they came back and they said, do you want to do another book? I said, sure. I'm not sure what I would write about. And they said, well, Rhode Island has this reputation for being, a mafia headquarters. So do you want to write about the mafia in Rhode Island? And I said, no. I really have no interest in organized crime at all. It's just not a topic that excites me. And then secondly, a lot of those guys are still around. So yeah, I'll write a book about them if you come over and start my car up every morning. So I then remembered the Sarah Cornell case. Said, well, here's this story where everyone involved is dead and I'm not going to get hurt writing about this. And, I thought I had an understanding of the case. And then I started reading up on it and researching it. And the story was just so much wilder and more complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated.
I had thought.
So how much ground research did you do? I noticed that you have reproductions of letters, facsimiles of letters. Yep. They're from the Brown collection, the Brown University.
Yep.
And I think the Rhode Island Historical Society or the Rhode Island State Library.
Yep.
So you seem to have had to do a lot of legwork on this.
Yeah, it was kind of fun doing that, running around. I went to Kennedy Park and I talked to one of the administrators there, and she had a history of the park that had been written, and it mentioned the case in passing. So she was able to tell me, oh, this is the spot they're talking about. So I got to go out to what had been Durfee's stack yard, which was creepy to stand there and think, wow, this is where it happened. That's fun to find the spot, but always a little chilling as well. I called ahead to the Fall River Historical Society and told the nice lady there, I forget her name, that I was doing some research into the Sarah Cornell case. And, this is the 90s, so I was calling her on the telephone. And she said, Sarah Cornell, what? Never heard of her. Ha, 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 ha. And when I went out there, a week later, she had pulled all the books they had on hand and just stacked them up on the table for me. They were all waiting for me there when I got there. So yes, going to Brown, doing research there.
They had the trial transcript at Brown, or the
transcripts are everywhere. They were reprinted and pretty available in different collections. I think they had them at Fall River. I think they had them at Brown. You can also find a lot of stuff online. A lot of stuff has been digitized.
Now
it's available online.
Right.
So even back then, I could find stuff as a PDF and download it and read it in the comfort of my own home.
Well, I know that Kesselman, who wrote the book on the case, it's a scholarly,
right,
thicker, denser storytelling of it. He was very involved in it, and he had collected personally a lot of the original broadsides and original publications that came out, including the ones you cite in the book. And he had first editions of things, and he became this collector.
Right.
And then one day I was on eBay and I saw this stuff appear, and the guy lived in Rhode Island, and I'm like, this must be Kesselman. So I wrote him. I said, are you this guy who wrote this book? He's like, yeah. And I said, so you're getting rid of your stuff? He goes, oh yeah, it's time to I'm never going to write about that again.
Wow.
Yeah. So I wondered if you become a collector when you become interested in a story?
Yes and no. I mean, I do. It's nice to have stuff from the period, but generally, I've just been able to visit it and not own it.
So, for other people who say budding historians who are interested in writing about anything, history, not necessarily even murder, but something from the early 1800s, which is this, that's what this is. This is a very long time ago, I think before Fall River had a newspaper. Maybe the Monitor existed, but serious. And you talk about journalism in the book and how it was cut and paste and glue and scissors. So a lot of things are online, that's for sure. But do you suggest getting your feet wet, your hands dirty, actually massaging the original documents? And is that important?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, it's always sort of thrilling in a way to hold something in your hand that came out the day after the trial, to wonder how many other people had this thing before it found its way to the library where you're visiting it. So yeah, I mean, if I had the money, I certainly would have bought every transcript I could have found. But sadly, I don't have that kind of money. So I wish I could be a collector, but I just don't have the funds.
The funds, I know, and it can be expensive. For those unfamiliar with the case, can you sort of give us an overview of the story that you tell in your book?
Sure. How quick a version do you want?
It can not an hour or so.
All right. So in December of 1832, a cattle farmer in Fall River discovers the body of a young woman hanging from a stake in his haystack yard. And she's pretty quickly, she's hanging from a pole. Her shoes are nearby, and no one really knows who she is at first. And then two people show up who identify her. One of them is her reverend. She's a member of the Methodist Church, and says, "Oh, this is Sarah Cornell. She's in my congregation." And then another one who shows up pretty quickly is a doctor who says, "Oh, I know who this is, one of my patients, and she came to me recently seeking advice." And from there it comes out pretty quickly that she was involved with another Methodist minister, a guy named Ephraim K. Avery. One of the Durfees goes to the boarding house where Sarah had been living in Fall River and finds some letters among her things, including a little strip of paper that says, "If I should be missing, inquire of Reverend Avery. He will know where I am," which seems awfully suspicious. So they go question Avery, and he says, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." But then more evidence comes forward, and it's discovered that she was pregnant. She was several months pregnant. Her body is hanging from this stack, this pole, with what they call a clove hitched knot. And I talked to some friends of mine who are Boy Scouts, and they said, well, the clove hitch it's a tension knot. So it's a knot that you have to keep tension on in order for it to hold. It doesn't sort of hold by itself like a granny knot. So the supposition is that she was pregnant and she was despondent and she hanged herself. But they point out the clove hitch knot is not the kind of knot you would use to hang yourself, because it doesn't work for that sort of purpose. So the suspicion pretty quickly swings over to Ephraim Avery, and public opinion very quickly moves against him, but also for him in some quarters. So from there, the story gets really nutty. So he's arrested. There is a probable cause hearing. Do we have enough evidence to charge this guy with murder? So the probable cause hearing is held in Bristol. There's this argument. So Avery lives in Bristol. Sarah Cornell lives in Fall River. Who gets this case? Who has jurisdiction? So Bristol decides, no, we do. They have a probable cause hearing. They decide that there is not probable cause to charge him with murder. He's let go. People from Fall River then decide, oh, hell no. They arrest him, or they move to arrest him. But when they move to arrest him, when they go to arrest him at his home in Bristol, they find that he has taken off. He has absconded from Bristol. And then one of the amazing characters in the story comes forward, a guy named Harvey Harnden, and he's part of the committee of investigation. And Harvey Harnden is like the Terminator. He's going to go after this guy. He's going to get this guy. Somehow or other, over a period of days, Harvey Harnden tracks Avery to Rindge, New Hampshire, where he's hiding out. He finds the house where the guy is. He goes into the house and says to the man who lives there, who's another Methodist, says, I'm looking for Ephraim K. Avery. And the guy says, Ephraim K. Avery? I have no idea who that is. And Hardin, stomps upstairs and goes to an upstairs room, bursts into the room and finds Avery hiding behind the door and sticks his hand out and says, "Mr. Avery, nice to meet you." So he drags Avery back to Fall River in chains. Word has reached different stops that they make that this is happening. So people meet them to see the murderer because, that this is already a big story. They get him back to Fall River where he's put on trial again. And there,
But this is Fall River, Rhode Island still, right?
Fall River, Rhode Island, yeah.
Right.
So the court case, it's a zoo. The defense brings forth all these crazy witnesses, and I talked to friends of mine who are lawyers, and they said that the prosecution has a hard job because the prosecution needs to lay out narrative. You say, this is what happened. And the defense has kind of an easier job because the defense can sort of just sit there and go, no, that's not it. So the defense doesn't necessarily need to come up with a story quite as much. They just need to say, no, you're wrong. So it's very much a case of the defense being able to put Sarah on trial. You try the victim. She had a reputation for being, a loose woman, for being a drinker, and for being promiscuous. And so they managed to put her on trial. They very much, I think, bury the jury with just noise. They take twice as long to make the case. They call over twice as many witnesses as the prosecution did. So I think it's very much an instance of just being able to wear the jury down and just confuse them and just keep shoveling so much stuff at them, which may or may not make any kind of sense, that it just sort of wears them and confuses them to where Avery is acquitted.
Yeah, he's acquitted. In Rhode Island law and how trials are conducted in Rhode Island is different than Massachusetts to this day.
Right.
But back then it was even more unique in that a accused is not allowed to testify in their own behalf.
Right.
So he's not allowed to get up on the stand, and the jury's not allowed to hear him tell his story and learn, and if he wanted to, and believe him or not believe him based on what he says.
Right.
There's also this odd thing where Durfee, one of the Durfees, where the body was found, decides he's the one that's going to go get the arrest warrant, even though the inquest hasn't concluded that a crime has been committed.
Yeah.
So he goes and shops for a judge that will give him the arrest warrant.
Yep.
He gets the arrest warrant, and isn't he also the guy who does it the second time?
I believe so. Been a little bit since I've looked at this stuff. So yeah, there's this.
And he's a private citizen, and
he's a private citizen. Yeah. So why? That's one of the puzzles in the case. Is just how does this guy secure an arrest warrant? He's just some guy off the street.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know how that happens.
This is 1832 legal rules in Rhode Island. It seems sad, though. It seems as sort of a level of pathos, though, that he can't testify for himself, that he has to be mute during the trial and have all these other people speak either in his behalf or disputing what other people are saying. It's almost, I don't know, it seems so outrageous and unfair, but who knows if he would have wanted to testify or would, because you don't have to testify in your own behalf.
Right. Well, I mean, Sarah, of course, never gets to defend herself either. And there are just awful things said about her.
She admitted to some of that, though, right? She admitted.
I mean, the more I looked into it, the more sort of three-dimensional portrait of her I started to get. I mean, I had thought originally, okay, so she's just sort of a party girl. But the more I read about her, she seems to have been, kind of complicated, and I felt real sympathy for her. The more I got to know her, I think she's a mess. I think she's just somebody who can't get out of her own way, and she wants to, but she keeps, tripping over herself. There's some of those letters in Catherine Williams where, she knows she drinks too much. She knows she should stop doing that, but she just kind of can't really stop. At one point, a neighbor's servant dies young. And Sarah is sort of, brought up short by that and says in one of these letters, why did this man die young when he's never done anything? anything bad. And you look at me and I'm a mess and I'm still here. And, why is God like this?
She spoke too soon, huh?
Yeah. But yeah, that's not a dumb person wondering about stuff. That's somebody who's stopping to think about their life. So
the letters in there that you have, they seem so misspellings and hard to read, and the language it shows some degree of illiteracy, but yet the letters that were introduced by her relative are all beautifully written, crystal clear to understand. And it's almost like two different people wrote them. Did you have a sense about how the handwriting expert could come to the conclusion that they were all written by the same person when the way the letters were written, not the hand of the person, but the way they were written seems like different voices?
Possibly. I never really consider that myself. I kind of took it at face value that they do seem to be the same person.
And it just something I noticed when I was rereading your book. So I don't know. Maybe there's something to it. I don't know. Ephraim, you pronounce it Ephraim?
I think I say Ephraim usually.
Ephraim. Okay, yeah. So Reverend Ephraim K. Avery, he was married. He had like 2 kids, I guess. He was a Methodist minister, and he held camp meetings, which lasted up to a week, and they were held outdoors. And it was here that they, I guess, proselytized in large numbers of people who came to camp out there for that week and experience the glory of God in the nature, right? So it's like this idyllic setting. They weren't sometimes very peaceful, sometimes they were quite raucous, but this is where he first comes in contact with Sarah Cornell. So
he'd encountered her before in Lowell.
Right, that's right.
She had come looking for a maid job. So she apparently knocked on the door and said, I'd like a job as a maid. And his comment on that was, Mrs. Avery not being pleased with her appearance, she was not engaged. And that's what I thought to myself, Sarah Cornell was hot.
I was thinking she was too dirty.
No, I was thinking the wife said, no. We're not having this one around.
That's interesting. It could be taken both ways.
It could be taken both ways, yeah.
Okay. There you go. So some people said that she actually worked there for 2 weeks, and he said, no, she didn't work there at all.
Right, yeah. And they keep kind of crossing paths. One of the things that I found sort of weirdly compelling is these two just seem kind of locked together in this weird, toxic, can't live with you, can't live without you kind of messed up relationship where, at any point it feels like they could kind of walk away from each other, but they just don't.
But every time she would apply to a new congregation, a new Methodist congregation, to be an apprentice or whatever they called it, where you were trying to become a full member in the congregation, he would write that minister and say nasty things about her.
Yeah.
And get her blackballed from that church, and then she'd have to move to another town and start all over again. And he harassed her, he stalked her.
Yeah, he's a petty, vindictive little man.
Well, why would he do that, do you think?
I think it's like I was saying a second ago. I think it's just this weird, like, we can't leave each other alone somehow. We're just in some bizarre way, fixated on one another in a really unhealthy way.
Do you think she refused him and he held it against her?
Possibly.
Went after her, so?
Maybe. I think maybe he's also just sort of a control freak. He kind of likes, I think, manipulating people.
Because she wasn't walking around saying nasty things about him.
No.
She wasn't trying to ruin his reputation at that point. She was just, I want to be saved and I want to join this congregation. And then he would let it be known, she was a thief and a pickpocket or a shoplifter, and she had sex with 3 men and she got gonorrhea. And I mean, it's like, what?
Yeah.
Like how can you get saved if your sins keep being brought up and thrown in your face?
Right.
And she even begs him to just stop it.
Yep.
And I guess he does stop it. So what is this Methodism? What is Methodism? And what is this camp meeting thing? They don't do these camp meetings anymore, do they?
Not as far as I know. So Methodism is a religious movement that starts in England. The founder is a guy named Wesley, and it's supposed to be a methodical kind of religion.
Oh, methodical. Okay.
Methodical, yeah. And it's a very much aimed at working class, regular people, to bring regular people to Christ, and to do it they have this whole system where when you apply, you're a member of a class of about a dozen people. So it's a little bit sort of hierarchical, I guess. The Methodist ministers have this particular kind of look to them. They wear these big, broad brimmed hats, which are sort of distinctive. The mark of a Methodist minister is one of these big hats that they wear. So Methodism is very much aimed at working class folks. They also are very much invested in getting women on board. So, Sarah Cornell is just right there in the target demographic. They have two different kinds of meetings that they do. There's the 4-day meeting, which is a big deal. They usually do that in a city, and that's kind of a convention. There's praying and there's preaching. And then they have these camp meetings. And the camp meetings are outdoors, out in the woods, and those go on for a week. And you spend the week out there, preaching and praying and being saved and listening to lectures and preachers. And some of the critics of Methodism really are creeped out by these camp meetings. They say, all kinds of crazy stuff is going on. Yes, you're going out there to get closer to God, but it's almost like the same lesson that we all got from those 80s slasher movies, you're just going out to the woods to drink and have sex, aren't you?
Is it kind of like the evangelical? Do they get whipped up like that?
Apparently they do. Catherine Williams in Fall River, An Authentic Narrative, which is a fun read because she has her point of view about this. She hates Methodism. She's deeply creeped out by all of it. And she goes to one of these camp meetings to observe and is just appalled at these, screaming fanatics who haven't washed since they got there. And somebody tells her, oh, you need to come back after dark, because after dark, things get even more intense. And then she just doesn't. She's like, yeah, no, forget it. I'm not coming back after dark. You people are crazy. So, some of the fears that go around about these camp meetings from outsiders are really kind of Confessions of Maria Monk, if you ever came across that.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, anti-Catholic screeds about the horrible goings on at the Catholic nunneries. Oh no. And the stuff they talk about going on at these camp meetings is very similar. It's a sort of, fear mongering and scandal mongering.
That's interesting.
But that's where Avery and Sarah reconnect, and she's trying to get these letters back. She has written letters to him, sort of bearing her soul, saying these are my sins, and they run into each other at one of these camp meetings, and they meet out in the woods. He says, okay, when the bell rings for prayer, meet me out there, and we'll talk. She goes out to meet him, and apparently there's some exchange along the lines of, gosh, I would do anything to get those letters back. And he says, anything? And I guess she says, fine, anything. So I suspect this is where she got pregnant. And I'm not sure if he returns the letters or if he returns them and she burns them. Like I said, it's been a while. I forget exactly what happens to these letters that he's kind of holding.
Yeah, when he later writes her, he keeps telling her to burn them. Burn this after you've read this. And of course, keeps it.
Sort of Mission Impossible kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. Remember that? Oh, I remember that.
So yeah, the camp meetings are these, it's fasting and prayer and lectures, but if you're anti-Methodist, as some people were back then, they're these terrible, horrible cult meetings.
Now, that's interesting. I find when I write history or look at history, it's sometimes difficult to go back in time to divorce oneself from a 21st century mindset and ethical and moral world. The idea that certain things are wrong now, but weren't wrong then.
Right.
Certain ways of treating people were regular and were ordinary, as opposed to today, which we would find outrageous. Right. And to actually non-judgmentally examine people's lives within the world in which they came, and let them be who they are without inserting ourselves on top of them, which it's hard to do, but you do it really well. I think you talk about for instance, populations and how few people lived in certain places,
Right.
and sort of how rustic life was, and how it was a really agricultural world in one sense, but then also this sort of industrial mill, ugly, polluting world in another sense, and the sort of strife that a mill girl would go through in order to earn just a basic wage and not have to throw it all back into her housing and the company store. Her standard of living was probably horrific throughout her life. And what kind of standard of living? She claimed at one point that ministers don't make any money either.
Right.
But he was provided housing, right? He's provided a parsonage. He's provided he has clothing.
Right.
She's on her own. She has nobody to help her out. So can you talk about life for her, standard of living versus his standard of living, and the power dynamic between them then because of that?
Yeah, I mean, she's going to have a pretty, hand to mouth, week to week kind of existence. She, at least luckily for her, is not working in one of those mills where they pay you in credits that you can only use at the company store, and they're not, requiring her, not gracefully giving her housing that they then charge her for. Now, I remember reading somewhere at the time that the scam was, well, your paycheck is $5 a week, and your rent is going to be $6 a week. So like the minute you start, you're already in debt to the company. So that was apparently a pretty common way of hooking people. But at least for her, she's not stuck in one of those mills. So she does seem to be making some kind of money. I never did find what she might have been making, what kind of wages she might have been making. She also moves around a fair bit, which from what I understand was reasonably common. You would apparently, work at one mill for a little bit and then often leave, going looking for better wages or better working conditions. So apparently there was a certain amount of shifting around from one place to another when you were a mill girl. Yeah, he of course is doing better because he's educated, he's a man, so of course he's making more money and is just generally having more comfort and enjoying more status than she is.
He doesn't have a reputation, right? Some people called him mean and some people but he's a Methodist. According to the Methodist religion, it's methodical and sort of precise and exacting. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't have like a reputation as a philanderer, did he?
There is talk later during the second trial that he had a study in his house, and the study was kind of in the back part of the house away from the bedrooms, and occasionally young women came to him for counsel, and he would take them up to his study so that they could discuss things. So there were those stories were floating around, and then apparently at one point it came out that there was a bed up in this study.
We won those day beds, those lounge things.
I think probably, but no one specifies. They just say there's a bed. So there was later there was some suspicion that he may have been a bit of a philanderer.
So her continual searching for salvation, her continual searching for which she ends up giving up on, but she goes from church to church to church to town to town to town to try to better herself.
I think so. Spiritually,
and appeals to him. And when you put yourself in a vulnerable situation like that to a man perhaps like him, I'm not sure if he really was like that, but let's just say for argument's sake, he is. She's opening herself up to all kinds of, he's a lech at that point then, if she's vulnerable and he's supposed to be ministering to her, and he takes advantage of that.
Yeah.
She doesn't seem to speak ill of him ever, though.
True. Yeah. That is perhaps, not the Christian thing to do.
He speaks ill of her.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I he's one of the things in researching the book and trying to parse their lives, like I said, my view of her changed. I came to have much more sympathy for her, and she ended up, I think, being a little more complex than I first thought. So I I have my own biases where I started to really kind of like her and feel great empathy for her. So I started to like her, and I just really started to dislike him. He just seems like, I'm kind of glad this guy had a miserable rest of his life because he seemed like he was an awful person and he got away with murder.
Yeah, I was thinking while reading the book that you thought that, but you don't come right out and say it, so you remain sort of even-handed throughout the thing. But
I do toward the end. I finally own up.
Yeah, finally at the end, you give your say.
Yeah, I tried to be objective, but when you read it, when you read the story, like it just adds up, so awfully. You think like, oh, this guy's just guilty as sin. A book that came after this one, The Door War, which is about voting reform in Rhode Island, and the story is so much more interesting than you think it is when I say it's about voting reform in Rhode Island. I went to talk to a collector and a researcher, Rusty Simone, who is the guy who knows everything about
Russell D. Simone. I know who that is. Yeah,
he's great. So I went to talk to him. I mean, this guy, I'm sure, has Thomas Wilson Doerr's baby shoes. He's
a Door War expert.
So I spent a lot of time with him talking, and at one point I said something about, well, my previous book was about the murder of Sarah Cornell, and he opened his document drawers there, and he had a couple of the broadsides about Sarah Cornell, and there was this sort of pause, and he said, that guy was so guilty. I said, oh God, I know.
You were able to finally come out with it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I've always been reasonably out there thinking, oh yeah, this guy's guilty as sin.
The first book that comes out is written, I think it's the first book, was written by a family friend. His name was Gurdon Williams.
Yep.
Called The Brief and Impartial Narrative of the Life of Sarah Maria Cornell. It came out in 1833.
Yep.
You quote from it in the book. You also quote from the next book, which is by Catherine Williams, which is no relation to Gurdon Williams. Right. Fall River, An Authentic Narrative. It's my understanding, and I can't find it anywhere though, but it's my understanding that Williams was commissioned to write this book by businessmen in Fall River who had interests in the mills and wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be the job that did her in.
Right.
That it was the religion that did her in. Do you know if there was any bias in that book? Do you remember reading about that?
Yes and no. I mean, that kind of like, oh, it was religion that did her in. I'm not sure Catherine Williams really comes out with that. She's definitely making out that Avery did this and that Methodists are scary. So I don't know if she's trying to make the case that it wasn't the mills, it was the religion. I know it's a weird thing to say that she kind of scaremongers about Methodism, but I'm not sure she's really trying to make that case that it was this rather than that.
The idea that she's commissioned by business people,
right,
in order to not say such bad things about what she did for a living. In other words, it wasn't the lifestyle that created the situation.
Right.
So that working in a mill is safe and girls can be safe normally working in a mill, and it's not a horrible life. And we want you to continue to come to our city and work in our businesses. So
Yeah. How are you going to get mill girls to come work for you if they think they're going to get killed by Methodist ministers and left in a field?
Exactly. Especially somebody that they're supposed to look up to like that spiritually.
Right.
So that's all I heard. And like I said, I don't remember why or how I heard this. And I've tried to find it and Google it and research it. And I can't say how.
Yeah, I've also come across that thinking, but I didn't really put a whole lot of focus on that. It's probably true, but it's not something I spent a lot of time on.
It's interesting because she's such an early female writer also.
Right.
In 1833, she's writing this book, which is unusual in and of itself.
Yeah, the academic press who reprinted the book, it was part of a series of early female writers. So that's how they latched onto it. They weren't a true crime publisher at all. I think it was actually Oxford University Press, and it was part of a Women's Voices series.
That's interesting. So is there any dispute that the murder was committed by Avery? Was there any other suspect brought forward?
There were there were attempts, but nothing that really stuck. I mean, like I said, the thing with the defense is that like they're just throwing out so many. It could have been this one. It could have been that one. She killed herself. That's their main thrust. The main story that they're pushing is no, she was unstable and she killed herself. And we've got 3 people who said that she was suicidal. But I don't recall any other serious contenders being mentioned by name.
Was there a thought that she had been strangled and then hung up? Because there's grass stains on her knees.
Yeah.
And she's hanging so that her feet or her knees are bent. So she pretty much can touch the ground.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. My theory of the case is that they meet out there. I think he tries to induce an abortion. It doesn't work. He panics. There were some workmen working in a field nearby who had seen someone who sounds like Avery earlier in the day. They had seen a man in a big, broad-brimmed black hat like Methodist ministers wear. And they had left their tools and their explosives in a cart nearby. And when they come back the next day, the day after the murder, they find that one of the sacks of equipment has been opened and a length of cord has been taken out of that sack, which sounds like the cord that Avery used that she's hanging with. So, my theory of the case is they meet out there. He tries to induce an abortion. It fails. He panics. He remembers that there's stuff in the cart that he could possibly use. I think he strangles her, runs over, gets a cord, and then strings her body up, and then runs like hell back to Bristol.
So her bonnet, the hat she's wearing, the kind of hat she's wearing, has a bow around her neck.
Yeah.
And it's underneath the cord that is around her neck.
Yep.
So to put a noose over your hat and then around your neck seems like an odd thing to do. Like when you take off your hat.
Yes.
Like, seems to me.
Sure.
Because it's bigger than your head.
Yep.
So that's an odd thing to me. Just the whole idea that she looked like she could have stood up based on the description also is, to me, rings that she was probably dead before she was strung up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's my thinking as well.
Yeah. So, okay. So the one thing in his favor to me is his alibi, which can also work against him completely because he's remembered coming onto Aquidneck Island. Now, these are things that I would have read when I was a resident of Florida, when I lived in Florida, and went, oh, okay. But now that I'm here and I know where these places are and I know how far it is to go from here to there. And so he lives in Bristol, which is up here in the northern part. He's down south on Aquidneck Island and apparently took the ferry over around 2:00 in the afternoon. And then he's going to do this walk.
Yes.
And he walks and walks and walks and walks. And then he says he's going to go look for coal. He says he's there isn't any coal open. So he goes to visit family or friends and he can't find the place and he gets lost and he asks for directions and then he gets lost. And so he decides, nothing's working right. I'm going to go home. And he gets to the ferry and it's too late. The guy's in bed. He's like, no, I'm not going to take you over there. I'm not getting up. Well, I'll pay you twice as much. He goes, nope, you can sleep upstairs, but I'm not getting up and taking you across the river. So that all happens. And then he's not seen again until the morning when he's in the kitchen at this guy's house by the daughter. Now, the case is made that he could have taken the bridge, which is from Aquidneck over into Tiverton, which is just a toll bridge. You pay a little toll and you go across the bridge, but it's closed at night. You could just cross over anyway without anybody there. So nobody would see you. But to go from the ferry all the way over the bridge and then all the way up to where Kennedy Park is, it's like 9 miles.
Right.
So he would have had to go all the way 9 miles and then 9 miles back. So whether he went south and only went over and up into Fall River, Rhode Island, he's still walking 18 miles that day with an injured ankle, apparently. Right. So to me, that seems in his favor, an explanation that it couldn't have been him. But tell me about that.
Well, he gets to Aquidneck and he heads south. He's going to go visit the coal mines. He's going to go see this person. He's going to go see that person. He doesn't see anyone. So that to me is not at all in his favor.
Okay.
He's like, well, I went for a walk. Who'd you see? Well, I didn't see anybody. Okay, fine, pal. And there's this one witness who they bring forth who ends up being no help to them at all, because she's saying, well, I think I might have seen him, in the morning. And they're saying, are you sure? Because it could have been in the afternoon. She's like, no, I'm pretty sure it was the morning. And they're like, are you really sure? How do you know it was the morning? And she's like, because I know the difference between morning and noon. But she also can't identify him. She just says that there was this guy in a big hat who she saw wander by. So that's the best he can do. On the other side, there are people in Fall River who, there was one, I can't remember exactly who it was, but there was somebody who said that evening they saw a tall man in a big hat walking along with a short woman in a cloak. Now, Avery is 6 feet or more. He's wearing that big broad-brimmed Methodist hat. Sarah Cornell's tiny. She was like 5 feet or 5'1". So a tall man in a broad hat and a short woman in a cloak are seen walking along the night of the murder. So that's more damning to me. No one can say, oh, I saw Avery and Sarah Cornell walking along, but that to me is a better ID than the woman who said, well, I think I saw a guy in a big hat that morning.
Plus, he was a walker, so he would go off on big, long walks. I mean,
he would do that. So, he was known for that.
And there was some assignation that apparently had been set up in some kind of a letter or a note that was found where they were supposed to meet on the 20th. And that was the day that she died. Yes. And that was the day that he decided to take this big, long walk.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So it sort of fits in. I just saw the 18 miles and was like, I can't do that. So if I can't do that, then how could you do that?
You probably could if you had just killed a woman and left her in a stack yard. That would put a spring in my step to get away from that.
Spring in your step.
I got to admit,
in the dead of winter.
In the dead of winter, yeah. So I think just fear and adrenaline is a great motivator that would make 9 miles fly by quickly. I got to get out of here to get as far away from this as I possibly can. I got to get back to Bristol.
So if everybody thought he was guilty, I mean, the guy who found the body, the family of the guy who found the body, they pretty much really were like, this is the guy. It couldn't be anybody else. And then he gets acquitted twice. And then the church gives him a free bill of health. And why? You said it was the jury got inundated with information, that was their approach and it worked.
I think that's part of it. I think also it's an early example of putting the victim on trial.
Right.
She was this drunk, promiscuous, out of control mill girl, and he's this upstanding minister. Who are you going to believe? So there's a lot of that. The
there were some things that weren't allowed at trial that were held off that were unfortunate because any statement that she made was not allowed to be repeated because it wasn't a dying confession or a declaration. Right.
Yeah, and there were letters that her brother-in-law tries to submit and can't.
Right. But he gives them to the paper. Right.
Gives them the newspaper, and that's when all hell kind of breaks loose. When a lot of people start talking a lot more. As far as everyone knew he did it, I'm not sure. I went to the Bristol Historical Society, which is conveniently located in the very jail where Avery was confined. And I found, I forget which exact book. They had a couple books in their library, and I forget which book it was. It was one of the transcripts, or it may have been the Brief Impartial Life. There's a letter in that from the previous owner to somebody saying, oh, here's the book about the trial that I was telling you about. And I used to see Avery around town, and I don't think he did this. But anyway, enjoy the book. So, yeah, there were definitely folks who seemed to think he was innocent. Probably not a lot.
Well, he went off and he lived an anonymous life somewhere in the Midwest, right?
Ohio. Yeah. He ends up as a farmer in Ohio.
So he gets out of the Methodist business.
Yeah, they eventually decide he's a liability. One of the features of Methodism apparently is that you have guest preachers, so you're always bringing in these guest speakers from other churches. One of Avery's friends is Reverend Ira Bidwell in Fall River, and they trade off duties. They each speak at each other's church periodically, so it's apparently a pretty common thing. So Avery does these sort of guest appearances at some other churches, and he goes to Lowell, and the mill girls all walk out of on the job when he's there, protest. When he gets to, I believe it's at Lowell, when he gets there, there is an effigy of him hanging, and there's an effigy of Sarah, well, not hanging. So yeah, people are not happy to see him. This kind of thing happens, periodically once it's all over. And the Methodist Church eventually decommissions him or defrocks him, whatever the proper term is, and they sort of kick him out because he's just making them look bad at this point. I don't know why they decided that, oh, now he's making you look bad. What about that woman he killed? So, but after a while, he seems to become a liability, and they get rid of him, and he moves out west to, what was west back then, Ohio, and farms. He becomes a farmer for a while and dies in obscurity.
Nobody wanted to bury her or to be responsible for her body or to foot the bill for her funeral because they were really thinking that she was this very loose woman who deserved what she got or had committed suicide, which is a mortal sin.
Right.
So Durfee buries her on his own property there in Kennedy Park. South Park now, then Kennedy Park. And she's dug up twice, I think, for autopsies and to examine her and stuff. And he puts her back in the ground and he takes care of it. And then later, when it becomes a part of Fall River, her body is then moved to Oak Grove Cemetery, and it's there now. I'm sad to say the headstone is it had been knocked down and broken off from the base. It's also made of a kind of stone that really fades. The inscribed, the chisel marks are flattened and it's hard to read. Somebody's propped it up against the little base, which is nice, but it was mowed over by a parks guy.
Great.
And it had mow marks right over the top of the stone itself. I think there might be a movement afoot to replace her stone, which would be nice because she doesn't have anybody and it's still visited. It's really hard to find, number one. Yep. You have to know what you're looking for, but there's this interest in the case still. And in Fall River, people have decided that Sarah Cornell is actually a ghost. And they talk about her on evening ghost tours in the city, that somehow she haunts Fall River. And that's the reason why the city hasn't found the success that it should since the end of the mill era, because she has put a curse on the city because of whatever. And what do you say to people who want to completely turn everything into a paranormal story?
Don't do that. So I live in Salem, where, we're pretty well known for the witch trials of 1692. And the story is fascinating. It's more complicated than people like to think. And kind of as with Sarah Cornell's story, it ends up being more complicated than you think it is. And I always find it sort of distasteful to try to make these historic tragedies into B movies.
And that's exactly what it is. A paranormal is like a B movie. You're right. That's so true.
So my approach to all these things is to try to give people the story as it happened or as close to that as I can get, because you'll never really get it, I think. But trying to give people as straight an answer or as straight a narrative as you can as to what happened, and just throwing in that, she's a ghost and she cursed the city, that's not helpful. That's not helping you get your arms around the story in any way. It's taking advantage of someone who died horribly.
It's a disservice to the memory of her life and her death. Sensationalize it like that when it was sensational in and of itself. It's kind of like the Borden murders. They were sensational in and of themselves. I mean, you can sleep in the Borden house and be freaked out by the fact that 2 people were killed there.
Right.
You don't then have to think, oh, there's ghosts in this place.
Right.
That doesn't scare me. It's the fact that people died there that's really scary.
Right.
or unnerving or creating anxiety.
Yep.
Because who gets to sleep in a murder house? Not anymore.
Making Sarah Cornell into a ghost who cursed the city. Leave the kid alone. I mean, she
really.
She had a hard enough life to begin with. I feel there's some similarity between that and Mercy Brown. Mercy Brown is a young woman who died of an awful disease, and her body was desecrated after death. And I've certainly heard the, oh, if you go out to the graveyard, she will chase you. And, leave the kid alone.
She's connected with vampirism, isn't she?
Yeah. Yep. She dies of tuberculosis, and the theory of the case was that other family members who had tuberculosis were her victims, who she was attacking at night and sucking the life out of. So it's an interesting story. It's an awful story.
All by itself, it's an interesting story. It doesn't have to have all the frou-frou, scary monster crap laid on top of it.
Right.
Yeah.
I've been part-timing up here in Salem at the Witch House, which is a 17th century house belonged to one of the judges during the witch trials. And as October approaches, more and more people come over to me and they'll say, "This house must be really haunted, huh?" And you always kind of want to say, "Grow up." One guy said, "This house must be really active, huh?" And I said, "No, the house doesn't do much." Does this road go to Boston? Nope, road doesn't go anywhere. Stays where it is.
Can't get there from here.
Can't get there, yeah. So yeah, it's sort of, the Salem witch trials are a horrible enough story and a fascinating enough story without the curse of Giles Corey and all the
Rebecca Nurse and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, Sarah died some 60 years before the Borden murders. So she's like 1832, and the Borden murders are 1892. But there seemed to be, in those 60 years, very little progress in regards to police investigation of murder. And sad to say, we can probably blame the authorities for the outcomes in both cases. To switch a bit and feeding off of what we talked about on our previous talk about spiritualism. So do you think this was more about incompetence by the police, class bias because he was a minister and she was a single girl employed, or just a sign of the times, or all three?
It could be all of them, really. There's no organized police force at the time.
That was interesting to me that you wrote a lot about that. I liked that part.
And you're kind of dependent on these committees of vigilance and committee of investigation. And, while you can think about, is it investigative incompetence? Harvey Harden's really on top of shit. I mean, he decides, I'm going to find this guy, and he finds him in Rindge, Maine, Rindge, New Hampshire. No small feat.
He has the nose of a Pinkerton. He really does.
He definitely does, without the union busting part. Yeah. So I mean, he's impressive, but there I think certainly some class problems there.
I mean, they don't want to like expose her body, and because there's men around, and they let women examine her, and they're not doctors, and it's just a very different world, than we think of today. It's not a thorough scientific investigation. Right. It is an examination as best they could with what they did, considering the propriety involved. Right. In a way. I mean, in the Borden case, we had like a couple of autopsy pictures, one particularly of Andrew, where he's laying there without his clothes on and cuts off right at the edge of his torso, but he's, split open and his stomach's hanging out. And I mean, it's pretty disturbing. Yikes. But Abby Borden gets no similar photograph because it would require us to see her nude in some ways. So certain things were still not done. And it's not like a photograph was taken, but it was held back. It was just not done. And that's 60 years later. They're still not. I mean, even in the Borden case, they won't talk about the rags in the cellar that were her menstrual rags, Lizzie Borden's menstrual rags. And the Dr. Bowen says, you don't have to worry about those. In other words, what a perfect place to hold bloody garments in a bucket in the cellar with menstrual rags. Duh. but they can't look at it because it's just not proper.
Right.
So just the sense of propriety about women prohibits a thorough examination of the case in a way.
Right. True. Yeah.
Okay. True. All right. What are you working on now? What's going on?
Bracing for
tours.
Yeah, bracing for tour seasons.
Yeah, it's October coming up.
Gonna be October, so always busy. Yeah, there's some days I've got 3 tours a day, so it's busy. I do kind of love it. I like being busy. I like having stuff to do. I was talking to a colleague the other day that, like as frustrating as it is, you get these sort of, this house really active? You get those sort of questions, but I kind of do just love helping people understand stuff better.
Yeah. I could see that. I can see there's a teacher in you. Definitely. There's an educator.
Just a pedantic jerk in the.
No.
I found that, I do a straight history tour overview of Salem history. So there's the witch trials is, one stop out of a dozen stops on the tour.
Okay.
And I find that all the other stops, I'm telling people stuff they don't know. For the witch trials stop, it's really clearing up misconceptions that they've come with.
Right.
Because everyone thinks that, well, we know the story of the witch trials. It was just these Puritan fanatics who wanted to kill all the weird women in town, or the women who had land, and you get the women hanged as a witch so you could take her land. Yeah, none of that really scans if you research the history of it at all. So it always feels like talking about the witch trials is much more clearing up misconceptions that people already have.
So how long are your tours? How long do they last?
I try to keep them to about 90 minutes. Sometimes they go a little bit over because I'm a bit chatty, or because, the streets are crowded. Particularly in October, like we almost need an air traffic control kind of setup, because we go to many of the same spots because history happened in particular places. So there are some nights that you get to a spot and there's 4 other tours lined up on other corners, doing their explanation of whatever happened at that location. So sometimes there's a little improvising to find your spot so you can be heard.
That's like in London when they do the Jack the Ripper tours. That same thing happens.
I bet, right? There's
all these different companies that do them, and they all, what I hear, I've not been on one, they converge every once in a while. And it's a sort of you're listening to that talk while you're listening to your talk, and
right.
It's across the street, but it's the same location. And
right. You hope the guys aren't elbowing each other out of the way. Yeah, I've never been to London, and it's one of the things that I kind of need to do is take 1 or more Jack the Ripper tours when I'm finally there.
It sounds like I need to come to Salem and take a tour with you.
Please do.
That would be fun, but not October, right?
I always tell people that October is either the best time or the worst time to be here.
So it's Dickens, is it?
It's a bit Dickensian. Yeah, it's Salem is quite Dickensian during October. So Salem is about 43,000 year-round residents, and on Halloween, on October 31st, we will regularly get 100,000 people in town.
Wow!
For the day. So it's shoulder to shoulder. It's super crowded. I don't do tours on Halloween itself because it's just too much of a madhouse. But you have to like crowds. You have to like the carnival atmosphere, which thankfully I do usually. But it can get a little bit much. And then the amazing thing is, you go downtown on November 1st, and it's Brigadoon. It's like nothing happened the night before. There's not a gum wrapper on the sidewalk. It's amazing.
Wow.
So, hats off to the city and to the Department of Public Works for putting downtown back together overnight.
Wow.
They do a great job.
It just sounds like something I want to do, just to hear you talk, because I never get enough of you. I can always ask for more.
Stop.
No, you're really entertaining. You're not only knowledgeable, but you're entertaining. And those two are like your charisma. It's like killer. It's just killer historian here. So thank you very much again for joining us.
My new tagline, Rory Raven, killer historian.
There you go. You can have it. It's free. But thank you again for joining us on the Lizzie Borden podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. Thank you.
Happy Halloween.
Ooh. Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden podcast, episode 21. We've been talking to Rory Raven on the topic of the Sarah Cornell murder in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1832. Rory is a prolific author, and his books can be found on Amazon. and at his website, roryraven.com. We thank him for this informative discussion. Find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube.